Today, we're diving into one of the hottest and maybe scariest tools in investigative interviewing: artificial intelligence. From robots and chatbots to the risk of memory contamination, we'll explore how technology could help investigators or make things a whole lot messier. Is AI the future partner in the interview room, or just another tool we need to handle with caution? Stick around as we unpack the risks, the opportunities, and the fascinating future of AI in investigations. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Our guest today is Dr. Brandon May, an applied cognitive and forensic psychologist whose work sits at the crossroads of human intelligence, technology, and investigation. With a PhD from the University of Portsmouth, he's worked with the institutions like the National Crime Agency's Human Hub, the London Policing College, and the National Police Chiefs Council. He's led academic programs in applied criminology and digital technologies, and in 2024 was honored as Outstanding Assistant Professor for his excellence in teaching and engagement at the University of Winchester. Dr. May's research pushes boundaries in decision-making under pressure, from virtual reality tools to covert intelligence and investigative interviewing techniques. More recently, he's focused on data-driven and AI-generated technologies to counter misinformation and disinformation, and on ethical practices for interviewing witnesses, victims, and suspects. His work is published internationally, and he regularly supervises cutting-edge research in deception detection, narrative framing, and gender dynamics in forensic settings. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am here with Professor Brandon May, out down there in sunny Florida. How are you doing this morning?
No, good. And thanks for the invite, Dave. It's a privilege to be on and to talk about some of the cool stuff, not just what we're doing, but I guess what's out there right now.
No, absolutely. I was telling Brandon before we started recording, I've been stalking his LinkedIn and seeing a lot of just really interesting posts and some really interesting research on kind of the trends in investigative interviewing, but especially as it relates to AI. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But I know your interest in kind of technology in the criminal justice system started well before talking about interviewing. So maybe give us a little insight to what brought you to this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my degree in psychology and cognition. So by trade, I guess I'm a cognitive psychologist with a sort of a forensic twist to that. And I sort of came into the world under the mentorship of Professor Becky Milne. And hopefully your listeners are aware of her. But she was one of the first academics in '92 to do a PhD in investigative interviewing alongside Professor Ray Ball. And a lot of our work there initially started off on the application of cognitive interview, peace method within 911 call centers. So applying those same methods, those same ideas in what we would refer to as the first interview, right? So if you think about interviewing and that elicitation of information, most often conflate that with the initial account with the police. So you have a detective come to your door, they take the initial account, and then the investigation proceeds. And our argument there was, well, that's probably not true. So if you make a 911 call to your control handler, whether it's police, fire, ambulance, that's actually your first account. That's the most virgin account that you're going to get from someone. They may be witnessing the event at the time, right? And we were arguing at that point that that's a point where you're going to start contaminating that memory. If you're asking a leading questions, you're going to start distorting the account. And what we found in that research was about 25% of all questions asked by control handlers were leading, which was really fascinating, right? Because you don't really think about that in terms of information elicitation. So we started there. That was in 2016, 2017. At the time, I was doing my master's degree in forensic psych. Again, this guise of forensic interviewing. I was at the University of Winchester, where we had a big, I guess, cohort of individuals that were fascinated with interviewing. More so, and we had a brief chat, but more so on the alcohol side, right? So we know that roughly 2/3 of all crimes, violent crime, are committed by people who are under the influence of alcohol, both witnesses, victims, and suspects. So a lot of that early research I was involved with, more so as a participant than a researcher, was understanding the effects of alcohol. So I've been exposed to this for a while. Now, with the technology side, I'm going to take a step back a little bit. So the technology side has always been there. And again, when I started, it was more on things like body-worn video cameras. We had auto pens. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, or the sort of the buzz back in 2016, 2017 of going with a pen that can record and transcribe. We had some discussions around that, and audio one video cameras doing the same and being uploaded and transcribing. That sort of technology thing has been there for a while. We did that, and I then took a job. I had enough of academia in 2017, 2018. I was like, I'm done. I'm going to change career a little bit and go into the real world of what it's like to be a practitioner. So I joined the Ministry of Defence, the UK version of the I guess Department of War now. And we had those discussions on not just behavioral detection, which is a big part of security, intelligence, etc. And I was involved in a number of projects doing that, but also how we can employ technology in defense sectors. So, and this was artificial intelligence in its more traditional sense. So think Terminator. We were having conversations within the UK MOD as to, well, what are autonomous weapons systems? How are they going to function in the if we've got fully autonomous systems like we see with Tesla right now, with self-driving cars, and we've got drones flying over different adversaries' land. Well, how are they going to detect between a civilian versus an adversary versus, et cetera, et cetera? So we were having those conversations around ethics of that, the legalities of that, and really what we refer to as horizon scanning. So thinking forward and looking at technologies as they evolve, so predicting how they may evolve, how that may look. So we had lots of discussions around that. We wrote a few white papers on that. So that was like my, I guess, my introduction to AI, but not AI as it stands now. And I'll probably touch on that in a minute because I think we conflate those ideas of what AI is. Just think Terminator. And one of the really amusing things is I was on phone calls with what was then the DoD, MOD, Five Eyes, and all sorts of. We were having conversations on just Robocop and Terminators and killer robots. That there were genuine conversations we were having, which I look back now, that's just it's amusing because we were still concerned back then that AI is going to take over the world and it's going to become sentient. A scenario we didn't want. There's some fascinating research by Professor Tadeo at the University of Oxford that started talking about the bioethics, things like just war theory, and expressing those concerns that we had back in 2019, 2020. And then I left after a number of years, and suddenly we get hit by this OpenAI, ChatGPT 2, 3.5, etc. coming out. And I think probably like you and many others, it was a toy, it was a bit of fun. And that's when that interest on LLM started to come in. Yeah, that path has always been within that investigation space. A little bit after that, I joined a research group focusing on intelligence solicitation. So I've got an invested interest in not just the investigative process in the traditional sense, like peace methods, etc., but how we also do that in the intel space. So if we're looking at informants, whether the FBI have their own sources, we have the same in the UK. How do we recruit those? How do we run those? And importantly, how do we ensure actionable intelligence? And it runs on the same process, right? You're still eliciting information from people. So it sort of extended into that, and we're now doing work again using AI to explore the possible, understand the probable, but also acknowledge the improbable. There are going to be components of LLM AI that just won't work for whatever reason, right? Security, and I'm sure we'll come on to that because that's a conversation I have quite regularly. Maybe it's poor leadership or application. And one of our biggest concerns is we'll talk about drifting. So this idea of algorithmic reliance, that we're focusing too heavily on AI. And for those who've read my paper, you'll see the first quote talks about that, right? Danger is not AI starts thinking like a detective. Detectives start thinking like AI. So they sort of they move the goalpost slightly, right? So like it as a tool, it's enjoyable to use. It has application, but it mustn't replace what it is to be human, right? Probably a whistle stop tour. I could talk a lot longer as to
No,
where my background is, but
that's fascinating. There's some interesting things you said there, and we're gonna really dive into the recent paper. And a shout out to the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group, or IRG, I know you published this last one in talking about this concept of drafting, but spelled with an AI. And so we'll get to that in just a second. But you slipped in there the study you did on with alcohol impairment, and you said you were a participant, not the researcher, more so in some of those. What does that mean? Because that sounds like a fun little exercise that you passed on by.
It does. So, I mean, I was pretty lucky in my university that, again, investigative interviewing was a big part of our curriculum. So we had a specific forensic psychology track and a master's in forensic psychology, where a lot of the graduate students, the PhDs, and some of the faculty were specifically interested in how alcohol affects memory, and more so how investigators can elicit memory when it's impaired by alcohol. And there's been this assumption for a while, and I've published this in a recent book that comes out in 2025, November time. So this is Milne and Ball, second edition. So the classic 1999 book we've just redone. And we talk about those impairments of memory. And for decades now, judges, juries, laypersons, officers assume that if someone's drinking, that their memory's impaired. And what research has found is a great meta-analysis by Heather Flo. And what she found is it doesn't reduce accuracy of memory. It reduces quantity of information, but the accuracy retains is pretty well retained, right? So if we look at accurate versus incorrect versus confabulation, accurate details reduce, so the quantity of those accurate details reduce. We don't inflate confabulation. So what that research was, and this was starting back in 2013, and maybe to the American audience here, we can drink 18 in the UK, so university, in part based on the pubs and the bars for the local. So the big culture is a big thing we have. So we were going to these on campus bars, drinking, knowing there's also a research study taking part. So we would go in, take like an initial memory test, then get incredibly drunk, and then we would go back after witnessing an event, recall immediately after, and then a week later we'd recall again. So there was a lot of studies at that point looking at how alcohol would affect memory. And this is based on alcohol myopia theory. This idea that you become very narrow-sighted if you drink alcohol, and the research sort of provided evidence for that. But we still retain detail, but maybe the peripheral, right? So you and I are speaking right now, so you're the same cue in this particular conversation. But anything on the periphery, and you may have seen this with like the classic gorilla studies, like a gorilla will walk in and bang its chest and walk out. People don't know this. It's sort of the same thing. But you don't pay attention to the peripheral details. You're very focused on salient. Alcohol will exaggerate that a little bit more. It doesn't mean you're any less credible or any less reliable as a witness. So the idea that you just throw a witness out because they've been drinking, or a victim out because they've been drinking, basically is largely problematic, because they are credible and reliable witnesses. I remember doing a project with Professor Becky Milne, and we were sat in the office, and it was great fun because we were spending about 20-30 minutes just sat in front of each other laughing because she couldn't straight face while recording this video. But it's based on this concept of the hierarchy of reliability, not based on the witness, how they coded. It's not based on use largely open questions based on the PIC method. You're going to have a more accurate, reliable account. What we shouldn't do is rely on credibility. So a great example of that is you've got two witnesses. One is an individual who is drunk, witnessing the scene, but they're at the scene. Then you've got an individual, they've got an MD, they're a doctor of pediatrics or whatever. The credibility is massively different, right? Because you'd assume the credibility of the physician is going to be a lot higher comparative to the individual who's drunk. And we've relied on that assumption. So you'd always take the physician's account as being more accurate, more reliable. But in this case, the physician had a bucket on their head. They saw nothing. Maybe a good ear witness, but they're not a good eyewitness. But still, in juries, they would take the credibility over the reliability and accuracy of the statement. We've been doing research for a while on that, and just produces this effect. But actually, you need to look at the context. You need to understand how memory works. Look at the research to say, well, just because someone's drinking doesn't mean they're not credible, doesn't mean they're not reliable, doesn't mean they're not accurate in their account. You've just got to get part of that to the strategy. Why we like things like the Mendes principles, and why I sit on that. While we've got things like the peace method and science-based interviewing protocols, because strategy technique does matter.
I want to go back to, because it's crazy to me to think, in a real interview, in a live interview with a witness or a person of interest or a victim, detectives are looking at the context of that conversation, right? So they can
Right.
maybe be a little more reflective on if somebody's experienced trauma or if they're under the influence. And I know one of the things that we'll talk about here is when we leverage technology, we kind of remove that human element. And you referenced this quote earlier, but I'm going to kind of bring this back up so we can really dive into the incorporation of AI in interviewing. But you said something like instead of AI thinking like detectives, detectives start thinking like AI. And that's kind of the underlying maybe risk we have in this space. So what do you mean by that? And then we'll dig into some of the specifics in the paper, but what do you mean by that concept?
Yeah. And this leads to my concept of drifting. So a good way to think about this is algorithmic reliance. So one of the things we like to do as human beings is offload cognition when it's feasible to do so, or there's a reasonable benefit to do so. So if we think about this in terms of efficiency, what's inundated with paperwork, right? And it's not the most enjoyable thing to do. If we can offload that, we will. Or that I've got 10 minutes to read that. You may want AI to summarize those statements. Um, and we're relying on our algorithmic reliance on this concept of drifting with AI rather than just I to offload that cognition. So it's then not a detective making those judgments. AI using statistical mimicry to present a narrative. And we're not going to say it's a true narrative, and we'll come on to why that is in a minute. But it's presenting a narrative that may or may not be to what happened to the ground truth of tell. And it may, and people use the term hallucination all the time. I'm trying to stray away from that, and if there's a reason for it. It is bullshit. AI just bullshits you. So if we have those components where AI becomes such a feature in investigation, then I think by default, don't rely on AI to give accounts, they become AI, right? And
Yeah.
there's concepts around things like AI witness testimony, and there's a concern. Anything where you have an algorithmic reliance and you offset or offload information cognition to that in itself becomes problematic. We are dealing with individuals, and as you said, who are traumatized, like trauma-informed practices. You're making an assumption. AI understands the context of that. AI understands trauma and the nuance within trauma. It can infer, it can judge, it can understand, and it can't. LLMs and I'll probably caveat this. When I say AI, I'm not talking about your Robocop. I'm not talking about machine learning, deep learning. What officers are typically using at this point is just LLM. So sort of Ryan, if you think of a diagram, and I've got an article coming out in the Florida Police Chiefs magazine that shows a diagram of this. It sits right at this epicenter of low-level AI. So sort of that's the very basics, and it will sort of expand out to things like machine learning, deep learning, and more true AI.
In your paper, as we talk about the different sources or uses of AI, there's a really, and we'll go back to these, but there's a really good illustration you have towards the end that kind of breaks down in a table what are some of the ways that investigators are starting to use AI in their space. And so everything, I'll just list them here. You've got everything from administrative support, which we'll talk about, investigative hypothesis generation, training, analytical back office. And then the last one, which is what I want to start with actually, is interview room interaction. And the table's really great. We're going to link the article in the show notes. So those of you listening, I recommend checking it out because you'll get not only the details, but also other resources in your kind of literature review here to go explore. But we talk about interview room interaction, and we have somebody who's actually using AI to help in some way conduct an interview. One of the cautions that you call out is memory contamination. And I thought this was really interesting. We had Dr. Elizabeth Loftus on earlier this season talking about really how easy it is to contaminate somebody's memory by using leading questions, the different words that we're using that can bias somebody's or contaminate their memory. But I thought this was really, really interesting perspective on how the use of AI can not only maybe create false memories, but kind of affirm those in the interview. So maybe you could explain a little bit more about what that looks like. How can AI impact our memory?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the citation in the paper references Chanadel 2024. Lizzie Loftus is on that paper as well. And it's a fascinating paper. So one of the things we see with AI, specifically in investigation and memory, is that, well, one is it overinflates. I want to play with this on AI, whether you're prompt engineering or just a novice user playing with it, it's going to massively inflate your confidence. It is going to say, Dave, you're doing incredibly well. What a fantastic hypothesis you've created. Fantastic question. Yeah, you can't go wrong. You're the best of the best. And what we see with AI is it's built to do that. It is there to enhance the user, improve the experience. It's not going to be a critical threat. Now you can prompt it to be more critical, but even that becomes a confidence later. So one of the issues we see, particularly with things like the information effect or memory, is going to artificially amplify that sense of confidence. And then that may be in the investigation room, but that may be external to that as well. So one of the things we used to see is this sort of co-witness effect. So you witness an event, you go on Facebook, you speak with colleagues, friends, and you contaminate memory that way, right? Well, people are doing this on AI now as well. So suddenly I'm going to put it into AI and see what happens. It may be for like a storage queue. It may be to better understand some of the consequences of what they've just seen, etc. But it's going to artificially inflate that. And one thing that Chanadel found in their paper was it boosted false memories by nearly 3 times, which is extremely concerning. Now, my knowledge, that's the only paper so far that's demonstrating that. Currently conducting research to explore that in more detail. But we are seeing those effects of false memories increasing through contamination and partly through competence reinforcement. Also, just based on its conversational mechanisms. So think of AI, and particularly the new models like ChatGPT 5, it becomes a chatbot, right? So people are using it now to just have conversation. And again, when we see things like misinformation, disinformation being propagated, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Copilot, they all sort of do the same thing in part, where they're, one, again, inflating confidence, but presenting information which is factually incorrect. Great example of that has historically been things like citation. An academic, you're writing a paper, a great way to see if an academic is using it, it just produces these accounts. So yeah, this citation really exists, and unless you know the research, I actually catch a lot of my students out. When I set them tasks, I know my research, I know the papers. I had one not too long ago where a paper jumped down like, I've never read this paper. This is really interesting. They found something I don't know about. And curious as I am, I'll go away and I'll look for those papers. And there's a journal that doesn't exist. Maybe I've missed that, or there's an author. The author seems quite genuine, but that it's producing crap, right? And again, I strive away from the term hallucination, because hallucination infers an error. These are error-less systems. They're functioning as they should. They're not becoming error-less. They are, as he put it in a paper, they're presenting bullshit. They're fictitious. They're not lying, but they are presenting a narrative that isn't true. Again, I'd encourage you to do this on ChatGPT or similar. But it's going to build a narrative based on all of your previous narrative. Unless you're clearing the system every single time, it is learning from you what you like, how you write, your interest, and it's going to produce narratives on a holistic collection of material, rather than that specific prompt that you've just generated. Um, so it is there to please you, and if it's pleasing you, you're more likely in that case to amplify false memory effects, and that becomes problematic. And one last point I'll say on that is, again, I think we take this assumption when we're using AI to run investigation, is it intrinsically understands what you're trying to achieve, right? So if you're going into an interview room, this particular event happened, it understands what that event is, what the consequence of those events are, the output coming from the witness victim suspect, and it's making all these inferences on that broad investigative scale. I mean, we know from research that investigators struggle with investigative mindset. We wrote a paper for the College of Policing back in 2020, and we supported a project on that. And we were still struggling then. And that's with human investigators, really experienced, decades long careers, the top interviewers in their field, and we still struggle then. The idea that we can just put AI as a trained investigator but has an investigative mindset, I feel is naive at best. Um, and again, and I mentioned this to you right at the very start, I generally believe, I think in 20 years, 30 years' time, we're going to see the first individuals being released from prison after being wrongly incarcerated, not for eyewitness testimony, but for AI witness testimony.
Yeah, well, I think so. I'm going to go back to that point, to what you said earlier with witness contamination and how it's not only maybe creating fake memories, but then supporting them, affirming them. And so I know there's a lot of providers out there that are creating opportunities for people to use AI to conduct an interview or to replace an interview in some capacity. And so I guess from what you just said about what does this look like long term, is there a risk where you've got some type of AI interaction in the interview? It's collecting a statement from either a victim or a witness. It's creating false information in that statement. It's producing a report or a narrative that's now part truth, part AI, fabricated truth, that becomes evidence in a trial, that later is then disproved maybe 10, 15, 20 years later. Is that where we could be going if we don't have the right guardrails in place?
Yeah, so I mean, my cynical head tells me that's exactly not where we're going. I think where we are right now. I think we are seeing cases as they stand right now that are going through court systems, both here in the US and abroad, where the case and whether this be explicit, so whether in officers, because there's still like a taboo, like you shouldn't be using AI, or if I am using it, sort of hide it under the table a little bit. So whether it's explicitly used or implicitly used, that people are being a little bit more cautious and not being transparent in disclosure. Um, but there's something there that is going through court systems today, and I've said this probably for the last year now. A reasonably competent attorney should be, I hope they are, um, closing down statements and witness testimony, etc., when there are AI uses somewhere in those systems. Um, because largely speaking, there is no empirical evidence base, right? So the idea of things like the cognitive interview, the peace method, NICHD, and multiple others science-based interviewing techniques, the reason we're confident to use those and to present that evidence in court is there is an empirical database now extending well back 30, 40 years. So it's not sort of this embryonic, it's out there for the first time. Let's see what happens. No, we've got decades, thousands of research articles breaking down the nuance of investigation and how we should interview. Um, to my knowledge, there's three, four, five articles that have started to provide evidence for this, but it's very much in its early stage. So you hear people, and I've seen this on LinkedIn, and it frustrates me a little bit. Where you say, when I'm an expert in AI implementation and put it into investigation, no, you're not.
Right.
Expertise in AI, particularly in the context of investigation policing, is too early days. What we're 30 months in, 34 months into to LLMs. I think there was one study that suggested 70 years of practice to become an expert in anything. So we're not there yet. Like I do a huge amount of work with AI, but I'm still learning. The evolution of AI is too quick for me to keep up with it, right? If you go ChatGPT 4.5 to 5, the involvement between the two systems and the tokens and the data that exists behind that is exponential. I think we're still too early days to be able to do that, and as I said, I think we are seeing those individuals incarcerated due to faulty AI witness testimony,
Right.
which
Well, and I want to go to what you just mentioned, peace and cognitive and some of these research-based, repeatable, reliable interview methods. And one of the things that you highlight in the paper is how kind of the overuse of AI might actually revert us back to some of the legacy methods that people are hopefully getting away from, which were much more script-based, monologue by the investigator, more like rapid fire Q&A versus this concept of, shut up and listen during the interview. So what did you mean by that, about how this AI might kind of be bringing us back to what we've moved away from?
Yeah, so part of me feels that in order to understand AI and investigation, we need to go back to those legacy methods. It's like you've got a newborn baby, a blank slate. If they don't know how to walk, they don't know how to talk. They've got to learn all those basic skills from the very start. AI, in my mind, is very similar to that. You've got this sort of blank slate, embryonic state where we're still trying to learn the basics. So, for example, how do you question? What is an open question versus a closed question versus a leading? AI needs to be trained on those platforms and the nuance of questioning. There are going to be occasions in investigation where you may have open questions as like the golden ticket, but you need to be closing the prompts. Again, if you're training individuals just use open questions, then you're not doing them justice because there are going to be occasions when you need to be a little bit more closed in the way you do that. You need to train AI on what that means, how that looks, um, the context of investigation and investigative mindset. Then you've got the basic principles of rapport, right? So I think one of the things often missing in current practices and in policing and AI is that we're still ignoring decades of research that state rapport is one of the key components for info elicitation. You have rapport, and I mean, Fisher and Geisman found this in the 80s. It's one of the weaknesses of the original cognitive interview is it was missing that element of communication. So you have the enhanced cognitive interview with that great sociality element. So if you don't have rapport, so that an AI largely undermines the element of rapport, then you're not going to have a good investigation. And I've heard some people say this. I think someone said this on your podcast. Garbage in, garbage out. Absolutely going to be those scenarios, and you need to train AI on what's good rapport versus what's bad rapport, and that's going to read simplistically. We need to understand those components. And there's a great systematic review by Professor Fiona Gabbard in 21 that started to break down those elements of rapport and what that actually looks like in investigation. Professor Lawrence Allison has done this with his orbit framework and maladaptive versus adaptive approaches. And again, this element of rapport. Let's say we've got a sexual abuse case we're investigating. Well, I'm not going to put a chatbot in there. I'm not going to rely on AI because it doesn't understand the nuance of trauma. Patrick Rosand did a great paper following the Anders Breivik attacks in Norway on how do we interview in a trauma-informed way? What are the components of that? How does that look not just for the investigator but for the witnesses, victims? There are so many things which I think we need to get back to basics, train up, and introduce to AI before we can even consider its use in a real world investigation. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't use it. And we'll probably come on to that question in a minute. When should you use AI? But right now, it is not a real time AI interview.
Right.
For me, we're back in the 80s right now. We're 40 years behind where we should be for this to be used. We've probably got 20, 30, 40 years of research before we can be somewhat confident to be able to use AI.
Do you think in that learning process that AI will, I mean, it's a complete hypothetical, but will it be able to develop rapport and have empathy? Will it be able to have more of a human element?
So it's a really interesting question, and there is definitely some suggestion that may be true. And the reason I say that is, so I've been working closely with things like EchoMind, so that's part of the Osaka group. There's research on avatars and chatbots, um, and there's definitely suggestions that we can build. And I'm cautious to use the word rapport because I don't know if it's true rapport, right?
Right.
Because how can you get a sense of humanism between an AI human agent, right? When I was speaking to ChatGPT, I'm not assuming it cares, right? I assume it can respond back to me, but I don't think it really cares about my feelings. Um, but with children, for example, and avatars, there's some fairly good research there. Dr. Sam Conway's done some great research on AI interviewing in avatars. Again, Pekka Satilla has done some incredible research looking at that. And there's definitely suggestions that we're moving in that way. But whether or not it's true rapport, how that looks for children versus adults versus vulnerable, I don't know. But one of the things that we've done, and this is a slight tangent, so I do a lot of research in disinformation and misinformation, things like um, Russia and some of the stuff they do. We've tested AI images and counter disinformation strategies, and when we use AI versus human generated narratives, the majority of the people can identify when it's AI, because it just looks a bit weird. It just sounds a bit mechanistic, robotic, and it's not as persuasive. It's not as good. Despite the fact it's more efficient because you can pump out these things really quickly, it doesn't have the same effect. So a great example is if you can probably see it on my, I don't know if you've seen my image on the university website, right? So that's my yeah, that's not me. That's fully AI generated. That's me playing around with AI generating pictures of me. Like, just pay attention to that. It just looks a little bit weird, right? So you get like the extra finger, or the eyes a little bit off, or there's something that doesn't seem right. People are very good at picking up on those differences right now because it's not quite good enough. Uh, and I'd argue the same with things like yeah, Echo Mind, a great system, they're doing great work, but it's not quite at the state where you'd want to use it in investigation because it doesn't quite do what it should do. It's still in development, right? These are
Right.
things that maybe 15 years time, 20 years time, that may be who you're speaking to. You might not be speaking to an officer, you may be speaking to Robocop, but that's taking those accounts. Um, but yeah, right now I don't think it's there.
Yeah, well, I think, and I've used this example, I think before we had an episode with Tom Meehan talking about kind of the uses of AI and a whole bunch of different aspects. And, I think about this gap of rapport and empathy. And my very simple practical example is anytime you have to call customer service for maybe it's an airline or like your cable company or your internet provider or whatever. A lot of the customer service agents are being replaced by an AI chatbot. And so like if I had to call and just book a flight for some reason and it was AI, that's fine. But if I'm calling because my flight's canceled and I'm about to have to spend the night at the airport and I need to figure out something, I want somebody who understands how frustrated I am and that I can feel
Right.
the response.
Yeah, I have this with I think it was either DoorDash or Uber Eats or something. I ordered a takeaway, and I was so hungry. I'd gone the entire day in the office. I hadn't eaten, and if you've been in the mood, you just want a pizza. Like that's it's been a long day. I just want to eat from my favorite pizza place locally. I just want something there. And like the DoorDash or Uber Eats, 90 minutes later the pizza turns up. It's cold.
Yeah.
Like I'll be honest, that's the most devastating part of my day where I just want some food and I want good food, but it's cold, so I want to get my frustration out at someone to truly understand and have empathy for my situation. Right now, that's my crisis moment.
Right.
Uh, so, but you're immediately put to a chat bot, and it goes round and round. It's like, okay, I want to speak to someone. Oh no, we can't deal with this. The chat bot, it has sort of these guardrails, these limitations of where it can go. It just becomes really frustrating. The example you used at the airline, great example of customer service being put out to chatbot. A lot of these are underpinned by LLMs, right? Because they don't understand. They're not inferring your indifference, your upset, your pain, your trauma. I know it's a silly thing to suggest, but people have trauma in and experience trauma in all different ways. You have a veteran coming back from Afghanistan, and then poor old Doris has had her handbag stolen. The trauma is equal. There's
Right.
no difference in the way we experience trauma in that way. That may be the most sentimental object about to little old Doris. The experience of trauma is equal, and I think we forget that. Um, and if you're speaking to a chatbot, yeah, they're not going to distinguish those differences. Maybe the data that it's using, that sort of statistical memory for prediction or language, will infer that the veteran is experiencing significantly more trauma in comparison to we've had the handbag stolen. So yeah, it's frustrating. And well, me personally, I don't want to see a justice system which is just put into chatbots, right?
Right.
I don't want to, see an incident reported on a 911 chatbot, and it just goes into the ether, and I have no idea what happened to it. That would be largely frustrating.
Right.
I like being able to speak to someone, and maybe I'm old school, and I was probably the last generation that didn't have phones and stuff in school. Like this generation is a lot more technically savvy than what I'll be, I imagine. So maybe I'll be fine with that. But for me, that's a concern.
Well, and if we take that kind of silly example of my airline issue and your pizza problem, but if we kind of extrapolate that, like eventually I'm not calling that airline anymore to complain because I didn't feel like they cared. You're not going to call DoorDash or Uber Eats and complain next time because you didn't get it wasn't reciprocated. Like you didn't feel that care or compassion from a chatbot. So now you're going to stop complaining. Maybe you're going to use a different service going forward. Maybe you're just going to stop giving information because it's not going anywhere. And I'm wondering if the same thing would start to happen where you've got victims who come forward that are now just talking to a chatbot. They're not getting that kind of victim advocacy or support. And so I'm not going to come forward and report anymore. And by the way, I'm going to tell my friends don't bother complaining to DoorDash or Uber Eats because you're not going to be able to talk to a real person. So don't even bother to call. It's the same thing in the criminal justice space.
Right. And I think we can take that logical extension again back to the officers. This idea of eroding judgment. If we're relying on AI, and again, this may be transcription, report summarization, lifetime interviewing where it's giving you those prompts. I mean, we had these discussions. This is all about horizon scanning and how it will look. Can you imagine a scenario where an officer in an interview room, interrogation room, can see live time, how they're interviewing, what prompts they need to put forward to the witness, victim, suspect, how their rapport is progressing, and we're eroding human judgment at that point. And again, this is the idea of drifting that the procedures we train in officers on how to interview, good interviewing practices, ethical interviewing practices. Um, if we just look at the Implemendes movement that we're seeing, not just in Europe but across the world on ethical practice. How can we ensure that if we are eroding judgment, ignoring situational assessment, what it's really like to be a witness, victim, suspect, and then interviewing those individuals? Again, we're relying too much on the machine, after on what it's like to be a human.
Yeah. Well, and so you just touched on a couple other use cases, right, for AI. So we talked a little bit about how it's used in the interview room itself. Most of what we talked about were the probably misuses or the risks or errors. Before we move on to some of the others, kind of goes more to the, I guess, investigative hypothesis / interview room interaction. But what's your thoughts on investigators leveraging AI um, as a strategy support mechanism of here's the information I have. Hey, what questions should I ask? Or what should the interview sound like? What about that context? So kind of pre-interview.
Yeah, and I can very easily get drawn into this idea that AI is bad, right? That we don't want AI. There's this sort of inherent evil in that, and it's very easy to take that the rhetoric that's true. And I say this knowing the irony. Actually, I fully support the use of AI. I'm one of those that I probably spend a couple of $100 a month with different AI tools, and I play around with those. One of my colleagues, Dr. Marshall Jones, who himself is a cop, a practitioner at heart, I've deep faked him. We've played together, and it's great fun, right? We do all sorts with it. And there's definitely a use case for it, right? So I'll start with the idea of hypothesis generation, and I'm cautious a little bit with some of this, largely because the research is very embryonic. Like we don't really know right now. One of the papers that Pecker and his colleagues published, I think it was the start of this year, demonstrated that there is utility for that. So it reduces things like tunnel vision. It enables you to generate alternative hypotheses for investigation. This idea of creativity in AI is generally there. I think there's a lot of benefit with that, but there's still caution to the wind in how you do that. So one of the things he also found was it was great at presenting alternative hypotheses, but a lot of those alternatives were untestable. So in the investigation as a whole, it definitely opens up your mind to things that could be true or things you could test, but there are also things that are untestable. So it sort of takes you down a tangent. Now, I did this in the recent LinkedIn post around noise. So it's just being aware that AI pumps out a lot of noise, a lot of false positives. So as long as someone's aware of that and they're critical of that, I think there's a place for it. So again, it's not relying on AI; it's a tool in your toolkit. You can use it to help generate different ideas, things you may not have thought of. Not necessarily offload cognition, but at least have like that sort of buddy in the background prompting you to say, "Did you think of this? Oh,
Right.
great, I did." Okay, that may be quite helpful. Um, The other thing that I think there's a lack of research on, and I'd love to see more research here, is its use as a training tool. So rather than saying in sort of a live investigation, I think AI has a place in pedagogy. If we think about investigative interview training, lots do it once a year, maybe once in their entire career, and they just get out and they practice, right? Um, but we see huge skill fade. So if you don't interview regularly enough, you resort back to natural communication style, and that is inherently leading. So again, about 25% of all questions we ask the natural communication tend to be suggestive, and we're very good at that. One thing AI can do, and Encomine and a few other companies are doing this, they're producing LLM chatbot avatars, which in the space of your own home, away from the office, or indeed in the office, you can practice those skill sets, and AI will converse with you. Again, it promotes those good practice, those good skills that you as the investigator need. Now, again, there's a lack of research on this right now. I'm one of the leads on the group that's evaluating that to see how good that is in terms of reinforcement of things like peace, reinforcement of those um, I guess best strategies. So yeah, things like achieving best evidence, open questions, etc. Um, but the early evidence suggests it's as a training tool very effective. We're lacking the research longitudinally to see
I,
how long that effect lasts.
I want to, two things. I want to go back to one thing you said, then I want to kind of wrap back up with training piece because I do think there's a lot of good use cases there, less risk than some of the other things we talked about. But when you were talking about kind of hypothesis generation and kind of having that second person, yeah, tell you, hey, did you think about asking it this way? Which I like that, right? It helps, like you said, mitigate maybe some of the tunnel vision or confirmation bias. And this might be way oversimplifying AI, but as you were talking, I was thinking about autocorrect when I'm text messaging someone or writing an email, and it's telling me, here's the next two or three words it thinks I'm trying to type. Like I've never actually wanted to say like duck you to somebody, but for some reason that's the word that comes out. And so I'm wondering in the AI space and Gen AI, when I'm thinking about here's my case facts, can you help create some hypothesis, some theory, use investigative mindset? How much of AI is going to be using past experience that I've taught it of what's happened in my last 30 cases to now be biased on what probably happened in this case? So is it going to still maintain an open mind, or am I actually going to create a bias in AI based off what I've taught it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I mean, so Birkin says AI is biased anyway. And one of the things I forgot to mention at the start is we're seeing this denigration effect. So for your listeners, so what AI does is it scrapes the web. So anything that exists on the web, open source, this is how they're using these models and building these models, scraping that data. So if you've got uh, an open platform with your name, so Dave, for example, your website or your podcast, it's scraping that data if it's open source. Now, the denigration effect tells us that because all content on the internet today is in itself AI generated, a lot is not through, or maybe it's artificial in some respect, scraping that data. To what point is AI training itself? That's the denigration effect, and we're sort of seeing that in part. That's also true for the bargain yourself, right? So if you're not closing your systems down to just consider that, what it's going to do is it's going to consider that holistically across cases. Because it's learned from you how you like responses. So again, when you use ChatGPT, you're often prompting it in a way to please you, and AI is very good at doing that. It's always going to please you. So the bias thing we can't remove. I think that's just intrinsic in human values. That's intrinsic in the data we have, and trying to pass that out of the code is. I hate to use the word possible, but in this case, I'd say just downright impossible. You can't do it. Um, that's not to say you can use strategy and techniques to minimize that effect. So, for example, it may be having a closed system. So it's not sifting all the responses that you like. And one of the things I'll try on this is more pedagogic than investigation. Is when you're looking at student data, for example, and you're playing around with, well, if I put this specific assignment in, and then I close the system down, I rebuild the system for this new assignment. but you don't tend to see that overlap or that conflation. However, if you do that without closing that system down, you know, Mary Smith and Joe Smith suddenly become one. The same with memory, right? We see this with co-witnesses. You've got, Joe and Mary both witness the same event, and they're both independent of one another. But the moment you put them together, that's going to become one memory. You sort of see the same thing. Um, and that's very hard to do unless you've got, again, the time. SSA should not be considered called for efficiency. Done correctly is going to be the same or take longer, um, because of the context in which you then have to examine, investigate, by things like, and I wouldn't say bias, but at least conflation of accounts.
Right.
It takes a lot of time to do that. I know Professor Amina Memon, we had this conversation a couple of months ago in another talk I did. And I said, well, I wonder if it could reduce cognitive load. You're offloading, so like logically speaking, it makes sense, right? But then she argued and came back, and I went away and really thought about this, and largely I would agree with her now. But well, if you're doing this, and she was doing this for immigration, the officers really do need to parse out the crap, find out what is genuine, what is fake, what is erroneous. You're reducing complex transcripts, from 10, 15 pages down to a 10-minute quick pass over for the key facts. Right, I have to read the 10 pages first, so I know what's true. Right, that's still going to take time, and I would argue partly longer. I know Ian Adams, he's an professor. I don't know exactly what university now, but somewhere in the States. I mean, he's shown that in some of his research that efficiency isn't a solution. It's not an answer to this. Actually, we take longer.
Take long. Yeah, that's interesting. I know I've seen that because even using AI for, help me draft an outline for an article I want to write, or help me, I'm on a new keynote presentation on X topic, give me some bullet points. Sometimes you do that, and then all of a sudden you spend more time correcting and doing the research to create your own process anyway, that it takes twice as long. So now,
Right.
the efficiency standpoint, what I wanted to kind of wrap up with here in our last few minutes, you started talking about training. Um, and I do think obviously we need more research and we need more work on it, but I do think from an efficiency standpoint, um, is really significant boost for investigators, because what we have seen in the training space, and it doesn't matter what the skill set is. A lot of people, you go to a training course, it's 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, it's a 2 hour webinar, whatever it is, and then you're put out in the field. And think it could be anything. It could be in manufacturing, right? You watch a training video on how to use a machine, and then all of a sudden you're there and you got to go do it. But you have to use the actual machine, and that could be expensive and that
Right.
could be risky. And so the use of AI avatars to practice interviewing seems like a win. If what? Like, what are the cautions? What are some of the issues that could exist that we're not really thinking about in that practice scenario? What are some of the risks in that space?
Yeah, so I guess the first point I would always consider is this is not a replacement of other practices. Um, so I talked about this in some of my PhD research, which was slightly tangential to investigation. It was decision making in things like counterterrorism, and we had a great scenario of things like virtual reality, extended reality environments, and I made this point really clear that this is an additional tool to our tool belt. So avatar training is not a replacement of your in-person role play situation. I think they still stand in conjunction with one another. So rely on those initial traditional training methods. You still need to understand how memory works, for example. I think that's a big part of investigation. Can't replace that with avatars. You still need to practice what it's like to be in front of someone and interviewing
Yeah.
someone. That's still role playing. Avatars is just a new tool you can add to that toolkit. What I quite like about avatars is one, they're very portable. You can do this on all sorts of systems, whether it be a full VR headset, and I think they're fantastic, but probably not for everyone. Versus things like computer-based systems. I know Echomind we put on just a standard laptop computer, and you can sit in Starbucks and practice those techniques, right? So they're portable. They're not the cheapest option. They are pretty expensive, and right now they're limited in scenario, right? So I think Echomind have maybe 2 or 3 scenarios right now, but they can enable you to practice on. Others may have slightly more. So they're somewhat limited in what they can do, but you can see in the future with more investment, they're going to just get better and stronger. Um, And then the other thing is temperament, right? So one of the things we're seeing right now, which is a great advancement of AI and exponential involvement, is you can really change the characters that you have, right? So you can have a child avatar to, an elderly witness with dementia. You can really play around with some of those scenarios. You can have someone who is extremely hostile. You can practice things like maladaptive adaptive strategy, some of the orbit framework. I know Laura Talisman's doing some fantastic work there. And all sorts, right? So you can be diverse in your training set. So maybe on a week-long training course for peace, but you don't have the time to do all of these different accounts. But with an avatar scenario, you could potentially do that. Now, one of the interesting bits of evaluation we're doing right now is, well, how would we do that? How long should that be? Like, I don't know if you've done trainings in the past. You start a new company and you've got to do all those really annoying online, sometimes gamified trainings,
Right.
federal requirements or whatever. You know, most of us tend not to do those. At least we don't truly take in what's there. We sort of skip through it and get straight to the test, right? And we just keep playing and playing until it's done. We want to avoid those scenarios where it's not you must do this once a week, once a month to keep up that skill set. Like we want people invested and really enjoy that practice. And hopefully, and again, we're not there yet, it is going to enable better, more effective interviewing. Not be more efficient, that's a slightly different question, but be more effective in strategy. And that's not necessarily to be just open-ended and questioning, but that is everything from rapport generation to prompts and closed prompts to context and that broader investigative mindset.
Yeah, I think it's really important. That's good feedback because sometimes we take technology and just replace the human element versus add to it, which I think is really important to think about. I know we barely scratched the surface. I could talk to you all day about this stuff. And so before I give you one last question to wrap up, we're gonna make sure we'll tag your LinkedIn in the show notes. I think it's a great way for people to connect and see what you're pushing out there. We'll also tag the paper that we've been discussing. So I recommend people, as long as you're not driving, go back in show notes, click on it. But a lot of really good information, a lot of literature that you've referenced is in there. And it's written in a really practical way. So a lot of good feedback and takeaways for investigators that are listening. So I recommend people connect with you. I thank you for your time. Before I let you run away, if there's one thing you really want investigators to start to think about when it comes to using AI in their space, what is some immediate, maybe either a takeaway or the one thing you want to make sure people are learning from the research you're doing now?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest takeaways we're seeing, and this is probably more in terms of, do I implement AI into my police department? And we've been having some of these conversations with police chiefs, at least locally in Florida. And it's don't just jump on the bandwagon because it's a new, sexy technology. It's definitely got a place in law enforcement, but be critical in its use. Don't use it uncritically, and really understand the consequences. Don't treat this as this is the solution to better investigation, better efficiency. But there's a lot of work that is still being done, and my head tells me there's going to be probably at least a few years of research that is needed before we can start being at least a little bit confident in that sort of broader piece of paper is here to stay. It's definitely of interest. We're doing research in it, but don't uncritically implement that. Really consider if it's needed, and if it is, what can you use it?
Yeah, I think that's a good feedback and a takeaway. And honestly, I'm thinking the same now when it comes to witness statement. I mean, even if you're not in law enforcement, but if you're in human resources, if you're on a jury, if you're just somebody shows you something on their phone, maybe take a second to examine if something just doesn't seem right. Because as you talked about, even these statements that can be AI supported or AI driven in some way can create some false information. So I've got a lot of good information from you today. So thank you so much for spending time with us. This was Dr. Brandon May, and we'll make sure, like I said, to link your contact info in the show notes. But thanks for your time, and thank you all for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.
I appreciate it, Dave. Thank you.
To help more listeners find our show, please provide us a rating, give us a follow, and share this episode with your colleagues. For the latest news and to engage with our guests, follow Truth Be Told on your favorite social media apps
And don't forget, we are available on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and watch a video of this episode on YouTube. On behalf of our guests and valued sponsors, thanks again for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.